Good morning. My name is Jenna Kromann, and today I'll be talking about an overview of baseline sampling guidelines for unconventional resource development. I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors for their significant contribution to this work, Steve, Pujita, Lisa, and Anne at GSI Environmental. Oops. How do I go to the next? Nice. Okay, so first to start off with a little bit of background. So what is pre-drill or baseline sampling? So people interchange these terms. Pre-drill and baseline sampling are the same thing. So it's the sampling of water wells within a certain distance of hydraulic fracturing operations before hydraulic fracturing operations begin. And why do people collect these pre-drill samples? And these pre-drill samples are collected to either prove or refute contamination claims, or to measure water quality and quantity in water supplies. A lot of residential well owners haven't had their water quality tested, so it's kind of to give them an idea of what their water quality is. So first, let's look at Pennsylvania for an example. The number of unconventional wells in Pennsylvania has nearly doubled since 2011, from 4,900 to 7,700. So there's a number of unconventional wells being developed. And then there's a number of water wells, and that's the black dots here. And there's over 1 million wells and springs in Pennsylvania. And this leads to wells and residential wells being close to hydraulic fracturing operations. Now, this isn't always the case. Sometimes there's a setback distance that is specified where these residential wells are. So the purpose of this study was to look at current pre-drill and post-drill sampling regulations and guidelines, and these are usually issued by state regulatory bodies, national regional organizations, and international agencies. What we wanted to do is highlight the areas of consensus and divergence among these different guidance documents that are produced, and most of these have key criteria for pre-drill and post-drill sampling relating to sample location, the methodology that you're going to use for sampling, the analytical suite that you're going to be testing these water samples for, the frequency that you would test the samples for, and then the time frame and the reporting requirements. And for the purpose of this presentation, I'll focus on the state regulatory bodies and tell more details about what they include. So what do these regulations and guidelines include, and who has these regulations? The final regulations that are set in place are for the states in blue here, and the proposed or draft rules or interim regulations are in orange. So there's 16 states total that have pre-drill sampling regulations or guidelines, but not all of them include like a sampling analysis plan and tell you exactly how you should sample these wells. One interesting thing is the presumption of liability, which Steve talked about a little bit earlier, and that's the burden of proof remains on the oil and gas operator in contamination cases, so that if a residential well owner claims contamination from an oil and gas operator, if they don't have any proof of pre-drill samples that they didn't contaminate the well, that it was naturally occurring methane there, then they're considered to take the blame. And these are the STARs, so Pennsylvania is one of the key ones that has this presumption of liability in this regulation. Just kind of get an idea of where these shale basins and shale plays are compared to where regulations are. So the shale basins and shale plays, so the shale plays are outlined in pink and the shale plays are outlined in red. And generally they follow with regulation, so wherever there's regulation, there's a shale basin. But for example, Nevada doesn't have any significant shale plays or shale basins, but they have regulations in place, whereas Texas has a lot of shale plays and shale basins, but doesn't have any regulations in place currently. So what do these regulations include? So this includes the location, so the type of water supply that you're going to be testing, the distance away from the hydraulic fracturing operations, and then the number of sampling locations within this distance. And then it includes a sample time frame, how frequently should these samples be collected, what time frame should they be collected before and after hydraulic fracturing, and then the different methods for sample collection, the sample location, the procedures, and if you should purge the well or not before sampling. And then the different analytical suites, so what chemical analysis should you test these baseline samples for, and different action levels, so when should you do something more. And then the reporting requirements, who you have to report these regulations and guidelines and your results to, and are these data publicly available? Can the public access them? So first, the types of water supply that are tested. All 16 state agencies recommend testing from the residential wells, but additionally, some suggest testing from springs and seeps, as well as surface water sources. And these are if they're used by a landowner, livestock, or for some other human purpose where it would be impacted if they had some sort of contamination. So next, looking at the radial distance. So this X would be the hydraulic fracturing operation, and this orange line here would represent a radial distance you would extend to look for wells in the area to test. So on the X-axis here is the state agency, the Y-axis is the radial distance to look, and on the top here is how many samples you should collect. So for example, Tennessee is about 2,600 feet away, and you would test all the wells within this radial distance. But then some states have a secondary radial distance that they require. For example, New York has an 1,000-foot radius that you look for wells in this area. If you can't find these wells, then you extend it another 1,000 feet to a 2,000-foot radius and look for wells within this 2,000-foot radius. And then California is interesting because it has two options, so it can either be 1,500 feet or 500 feet projected from the horizontal well bore. So next, the sampling time frame. So when should these samples be collected? When should pre-drill samples be collected? So 6 state agencies define a collection time for pre-drill sampling, and 9 state agencies define a collection time for post-drill sampling. And this can start as early as 1 year to 6 months before pre-drill sampling, and then can start as early as soon as a week after sampling, and as many as 6 years after sampling. For example, Colorado suggests sampling 3 times, so once before hydraulic fracturing operations begin, and then twice after hydraulic fracturing operations. So, and not all suggest after production well development. Some have different words like spudding the well or before hydraulic fracturing operations begin. There's different regulatory terms, but basically before and after hydraulic fracturing. So next is where are you getting this sample from? So you're mainly getting it from a sample port here, and you might ask, why couldn't you take it from the wellhead directly? Because you want to get it as close to the sample port as possible. But you can see here there's a cap on this residential water supply well, so it'd be difficult to crack open this well and disturb the well, and someone's actually using this for water supply, so you don't want to do that. So you take it from a sample port, and this is what it would look like. And you want to make sure that you're taking it before water treatment systems, so you're getting a representative sample. Another thing is purging, and this is taking out the water that's just stagnant and stored in the well bore. You want to make sure that you're pulling water directly from the formation. So some regulations and guidelines suggest parameter stability, so taking a field testing of different temperature, conductivity, and seeing when these different parameters start to stabilize. And then once they start to stabilize, usually then you take a sample here. And then some suggest 3 casing volumes, so the volume of the well bore 3 times, pumping it out before you take a sample. And then Nevada suggests up to 4 casing volumes or more before you start to sample a well. So next, looking at the analytical suite, so what are you testing these water samples for? On the x-axis here is the state agency, the y-axis is the number of analytes. So there's quite a range here in the 16 states what they suggest testing for. So Alaska is the highest with 46 analytes, and then Tennessee with 9 analytes. So 75% of the 16 states suggest these sample parameters, You can see barium is an important one, and you might ask why barium. And barium is a part of drilling mud, and so it could be an indicator possibly of maybe some contamination. And then BTEX is used in hydraulic fracturing fluids as well as condensate from the fluids, so it could be another indicator of contamination. And then methane, of course, is really important in this. And this is what 25 to 75% of states recommend testing. And then less than 25% of states recommend testing this. And one thing to note is the ORP value. This is a really simple analysis to do, and it's really important, as we've seen in the previous presentations and in Steve's talk, that the oxidation reduction potential is important. So it might be suggested in other areas. And then the next thing is action limits. So at what concentration do you do further analysis, or do you come back and do more analysis? And one of these that's really important is the dissolved methane concentration. So if you detect a dissolved methane concentration above 1 milligram per liter in Alaska, Colorado, and North Carolina, 5 milligrams per liter in Wyoming, and 7 milligrams per liter in Pennsylvania, and 10 milligrams per liter in Nevada, then you would have to perform isotopic analysis to determine if this is a naturally occurring methane type or determine the different gas type that's occurring here. And then also some agencies have other action levels from BTEX, TPH, chlorides, and other parameters. So if they're above a certain EPA limit, or if there's an elevated concentration from your pre- and post-drill sampling, you may have to do further analysis, or this could indicate a change in the water quality of residential wells. So there is other national and regional organizations that offer pre-drill and post-drill sampling guidelines, but for the sake of this presentation, I could only talk about the state guidelines. So here are some of the national and regional organizations and some of the international agencies that offer guidelines for pre-drill sampling. So in conclusion, state agencies and regulations and guidelines vary considerably, as we have seen here, with respect to the sample distance from the production well, the number of sampling locations, the sampling methodology, and the timeline for frequency, and then the recommended analytical suite. So there's a need for more consistent regulations and guidelines for these pre-drill hydraulic fracturing samplings so that you can compare samples across shale plays, because the sampling procedure that you're using is really important. As well as something also to note is that residential wells are not monitoring wells, so we can't use the same sort of procedure that we use on monitoring wells. We have to develop a new consistent procedure with residential wells. And just to give you a little bit of a preview of what GSI is working on right now, they're working on a DOE RIPC project, so Research Partnership to Secure Energy for America. And what they're looking at is sampling variability. So does a different sampling collection method create a variability in the methane concentrations that you could obtain? So on the x-axis here is the direct fill method, and the y-axis represents methane concentrations for isoflask method, which is the blue diamonds here, and the inverted bottle method, which is the green triangles. And you can see that they're fairly consistent until about 12 milligrams per liter, where they start to diverge. So this shows that sampling collection and how you collect your samples is really important, and the methods that are analyzed. So there's need for more consistency among how we're exactly gathering these pre-drill and baseline sampling analysis. So I'd like to take any questions at this time.
Any questions?
Can you say something about the two different methods, the isoflask versus inverted bottle, and why you think above 12 grams per liter the data diverge?
Steve, can you come to the
Yeah, sure. So we looked at, this is in Pennsylvania, we had about 12.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. So you were asking what was the difference between the isoflask method and the inverted bottle method, and what might be the reason for that difference? Is that what your question was? So we had about 12 residential wells that were from that subset of the 1,500 that I showed, and we wanted to answer some of the questions that others are trying to answer, which is, does sampling methodology matter? And so the isoflask is really a closed system. I'm not sure if you must be familiar with the isoflask. So it's essentially it's the sort of the new and improved Tedlar bag, so to speak. So you'd attach the isoflask to a sampling manifold, and you collect the sample all encompassing. The inverted bottle method is where you'd flip the vial into the bucket upside down with the water. What we found was that you still get gas trapped in the vials. We still had a lot of difficulty doing that method properly. So we think that the difference is what you're seeing there. And again, all those who compare the direct fill method, which I think there are some flaws. Obviously, you're just holding the vial over the faucet. So it's not a surprise that the isoflask would have a higher methane concentration. The inverted bottle, I have a feeling that it was underestimating because we had some gas bubbles collected in the vials. So some of our wells were upwards of 20 milligrams per liter, and so there were some effervescing wells, which made it very difficult, we found, to do the inverted bottle method.
Jenna, you showed the radius around the well in which the different state samples varies from 1,000 feet to more than 2,500.
Yes.
Based on this, which rationale do the states select this radius, do you know? Based on which arguments do they decide?
How do they decide? It seems sort of arbitrary based on regulations and guidelines, but I would say the most common one is about a mile away from the well. And a lot of states, I think, looked at other states' guidelines to help them set up what their radius would be. There's no really scientific justification right now for the set radius distance that they have, as far as I can tell from the regulations and guidelines. Yeah.
Sampling surface water, sampling springs,
Mm-hmm.
and then are these, do they make sense in terms of, I noticed in Mexico samples surface water.
Yes.
That's the largest, the shortest time, there was sampling a week after, and they also have the largest.
Mm-hmm.
That could make sense in some areas of Mexico, but not others.
Yeah, I think it probably predominant where the shale basin is and where their sampling methods are. And New Mexico doesn't have a set sampling regulation. So usually for surface water, it's either livestock ponds or something that livestock or residents are relying on for water supplies. Does that answer your question? Your question was related to that? Okay.
I have a question for you,
Yeah.
too. What about releasing that data to the public, the state of the regulations for that in the different states?
In the different states? Yeah, so some recommend, like Colorado recommends you have to submit a certain analysis plan and how you collected your samples and the results of your samples, and then this gets published on a database that can be accessed by the public and by other people that are interested in learning about regulations and samples. So only a couple of states actually have this data or suggest that this data should be available publicly, and then some just suggest that the department should keep it and have access to it to review the guidelines and data.
Any other question? Thank you, Jenna.
Thank you.